I can never read all the books I want. I can never be all the people I want and live all the lives I want. I can never train myself in all the skills I want. And why do I want? I want to live and feel all the shades, tones, and variations of mental and physical experience possible in my life. And I am horribly limited. Sylvia Plath. Hey folks, I'm Gale Huxley.
I'm Rick Chambers.
Welcome to Book Sense. We view the world through perceptual lenses. You carry many of them with you now. Your common sense, your culture. On Book Sense, we talk about all aspects of life, history, and society through the lens of stories. So choose your tool, a lens or a spyglass. Use it to break through soil until you feel fresh air, and join us.
I would like to start with just my first reaction. When you emailed this quote to me, I thought, that's it. I love it. There was an immediate sense that she is the strange thing, part of my tribe. I felt like I belonged. We talked in the first episode about what books can provide, like a sense of not being alone, not being lonely, and of actual belonging, which is really, really strange because I don't think I would remind people of Sylvia Plath if they met me on the street, or no one would think we would like kind of feel this kind of belonging or resonance. But not because I rejected her or didn't like her, but all I know about her is what you just said. So I didn't see her as kind of relevant or as urgent to read. And this is where the value of a quote, this quote kind of cuts through all of that to a more universal place.
Yes, because everybody has felt this way at some point. That they're so limited by their life. You have to make a decision what path you want to go down. You can't change who you are over and over and over again unless you want to face consequences. Although, I would say, and something I was thinking about when I was considering this quote, is that although you can't completely change who you are, where you're from, what family you're born into, you're forced to reinvent yourself in life at some point. You're forced to become a new person. You look at yourself 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and often people say, who was that person?
Which is interesting because you're usually forced. It's not a choice to... Most of the time you're kicking and screaming if you have to reinvent yourself.
And if you are not completely satisfied with your life, it's comfortable. Reinvention's never comfortable.
Yes. And so while what she's saying in some sense is universal, in another sense it's very kind of challenging to the common way of thinking about things. Most people want to be one person. Or I can just imagine someone being confused by what she's saying and thinking it is like a person who... You would be allowed to have these thoughts younger than her, but she was having these thoughts.
Yeah, she was probably in her early 20s when she was having these thoughts. Although, when The Bell Jar was published, she was 30. So.
But at what age? Like when you ask children, who do you want to be when you grow up? Like when are we supposed to resolve all of these questions?
So early in life. There's not a lot of freedom past childhood, past being a teenager. Something that I was also thinking about was in school. Children are, I don't know so much here in the curriculum unless they go to a performing arts or science high school, but my husband in France, he told me that in middle school they have to choose their path, whether they want to be in engineering or if they want to go into the technical school, and like from the age of 12.
Professionally, musically, sports, there is this pressure to earlier and earlier choose your path.
Yeah, well, especially with music or sports, especially with sports, because if you haven't started when you're a child and gained that ability, then you
Well,
can't
even
be.
with career, parents stress over which pre-K to send a child to.
But also in college, I mean, there's still 18-year-old, like 18 is very young, even in your early 20s, and you have to choose a major, which people often switch throughout the years or don't work in their major.
So the phrase, I want to live and feel all the shades, tones, and variations of mental and physical experience possible. Very different. The idea today is pick the best, the winning path, the most successful path, not pick every path.
Yeah, it's impossible to like pick every path and be seen as a responsible adult. How do you do that if you have a
Yes.
family?
And as a subjective person, she's not saying she wants success, money, status. She wants, you mentioned raw, she wants raw and varied experience. And doesn't label it good, bad, right, wrong.
It's just her desire. And she was very tortured by this desire. I mean, she was a very tortured person in life.
I'm not that familiar. What did you just mean, very tortured?
Well, Sylvia Plath, some people only know her because of the way she died, or because she was a very depressed person. So she died by suicide, carbon monoxide poisoning. She put her head in the oven, and we were just talking about off of recording that you actually knew that about her, or
Yes.
that it was a
Yes.
phrase or a joke. And also, she had a long history with mental illness. When she was, I believe, 20, somewhere around there, she had attempted suicide. She crawled up under her house. She stayed there for 3 days. I think it's McLean Mental Hospital, McLean, that she was in for 6 months after that. And depression was a common theme in her life. And though she was there was so much more to her intelligence, to the fact that she was just craving a wealth and diversity of experience. That's what she was known for being tortured.
Yes, exactly. So that's what general or common knowledge would kind of know about her. And even though I'm in the mental health field, with an artist, she came to represent in many ways perhaps the tortured artist, but in some ways it led to discounting her work or not. It made her very famous, but in some ways or in certain circles, perhaps her work was discounted.
Well, it was a very, almost feminized type of
Exactly.
torture. There's a lot of artists that were tortured, but also very well respected.
Which is often written, but especially with it being a female, very internal, very focused on feelings, in especially the culture of her time, which was part of the torture, all of that was discounted.
So that was a common theme in her writing. She often highlighted problems with women in the workforce in the 1950s, and she died in 1963. So she died right before feminism really was a thing. But in the Bell Jar, she wrote a lot about how women were kind of forced into secretarial roles. They had to work under men, and it bothered her.
Yes, and this may be where the title is Tend Your Imaginary Fig Tree. I do know from something you sent me earlier that had something to do about a job interview or...
But this also carried over to her personal life. She was married to Ted Hughes, a famous British poet. And it was a very difficult marriage. A lot of the time because he was cheating on her and there was affairs that really affected her mental health. But also she was portrayed as living in his shadow. In the movie Sylvia, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, she was very much portrayed this way, as if she was living in his shadow and she was bothered by it. She was a crazed woman, just obsessed with getting his love, being the only woman to receive his love, as if she was nothing more than that. And her two children, Frida and Nicholas, really hated that movie for that reason, because there was so much more to her. But the media likes to focus on that with women.
Yes. And you mentioned it was before people thought in terms of women's liberation, but if it had been 50 years before her, it would have been kind of the classic hysterical, emotional woman that was kind of treated by, or at the very foundation of the psychoanalytic movement of, so anything that dealt with women's emotions, with being internal, subjective, has a long history of being discounted.
Yes, that reminds me when you said 50 years prior of, there was a lot of, or not a lot, I'm not sure how much, literature that came out in the 19th century about the idea of an hysterical woman. The story that comes to mind is a story written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman called The Yellow Wallpaper. In the story, her husband rents a mansion for her to get air and to recuperate because he says that she's suffering from a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. And so she's locked in a room with the yellow wallpaper, and that is when she actually does start going a little crazy because she is not allowed to express her emotions.
Excellent, yes. And so there's, and it continues to today, where being a woman and having emotions it can be pathologized, it can be discounted, it's just emotions. And yet, what she's writing is, in some ways, very, very strong and very challenging.
No, it doesn't, it does strike me, there's emotion there, but it doesn't strike me as very emotional or feeling. I see a desire here.
Excellent.
Not depression.
That was my first response. I thought, she's hungry. Like there's this hunger in her.
Yes.
That can't be filled.
No, and that is the problem, that she could not see a way for that to be filled. And something that was really interesting to me is that she had such a desire to live all of these lives. And people get into the arts, into being actors, actresses, musicians, they cosplay, anything, because they can experience so many different lives. But her writing was so autobiographical, and it was very confessional. It was concerned with her life, herself, trying to figure it out, really.
Exactly. Something that's been discounted as much as women or emotions, or especially the combination of the two, imagination. And her life was very restrained, very constrained, and yet through her imagination, there were no limits.
Yes. Although some of the most celebrated men in history are celebrated because of their imaginations.
Any creative person?
Yeah. Well, any
Right.
creative person. And even scientists, that it requires imagination to think of what there could be.
A secretary and a housewife's imagination.
That's so internalized. Where is their expression for that?
Yes, in many ways, I think the torture that she experienced throughout her life was the tension between the fruitfulness of her creativity and the drive there, everything that was there, and the constraining elements of her actual life.
Yeah, though she was very productive. She had several volumes of poetry, only one novel. But I think a lot of creative people are stifled by this, and they end up producing nothing because there's so much within them that they want to express.
Excellent, yes. And so in looking for all that life could offer her, all the experiences, she was not looking for success or for money. what if she was looking to be heard? For a creative person, the worst torture is, no matter how fruitful you are in your journals or even in your writing, the sense of not being heard.
Or even just as a person, not even as a creative.
Excellent.
Because I was saying that also the fact that she's not being seen in all of her entirety and all of her enormity and her complexity. It's hard when you feel that there's so much within you, it's hard to express. You're at risk of becoming almost nobody.
Right. So normal would mean nothing unique to say, nothing...
Yeah, there's nothing identifiably unique
no
about
particular reason for you to be here.
Yeah. And that's often the case with introverted people in general. You have to dive deep within them to see what is unique.
Yes.
Yes, there is that quote who I cannot remember now. Never love someone who thinks thinks you're normal. I'm misquoting it. I think it's Oscar Wilde. That sounds about right.
Could be. So there may be things that I would say within this context that would sound strange in a regular conversation, but I have often said, like, what I'm looking for really can't be found on this world. Mm-hmm. What if in some people there are some people that what they're looking for can be found easily. But I'm 60 now, and so I kind of know there's always something else I'm looking for. And I think that's why I resonated so to this quote.
And I resonate with this quote a lot. At 20 is when I first read this quote, and I felt like I was allowed to feel this way, to feel that I haven't figured out who I want to be, that there's so many different paths I want to take, and I can try them all. Now I'm 26, and I'm married, getting closer and closer to 30, and I still feel this way. I haven't accomplished anything I want to accomplish. I haven't even really started my career, and people are always asking, well, what are you doing with your life? And I don't know what to tell them, and I feel less and less like I am allowed to feel this way.
And does that hunger to live many lives ever really go away?
I don't think so.
Is one life enough?
No, and that's
or one set of circumstances, or one narrative?
And that's why the idea of reincarnation is so attractive. But unfortunately, even with that idea, you don't know what you're experiencing. And is escapism enough to satisfy this feeling? So
what we've done with the imaginal and the imagination is to reduce it to escapism or fantasy. And yet, it's where experience can expand beyond one set of circumstances, one lifetime. She may be giving voice to wherever imagination comes from. And this desire for something not in the concrete world, not in the ordinary world, for a big adventure, for...
And she wasn't speaking from a religious perspective or any one perspective, just it was very human, but also more than human.
She wanted to experience it all.
Yes. And also, something that I got from this is that she was very aware of how fleeting life is, how fast it goes. When I thought about that, because she said, I can never read all the books I want. And as a bookworm, I can tell you, I feel that way all the time as I look at my stacks and stacks of books that I'll probably never finish in this lifetime.
At the local coffee shop here, instead of graffiti in the restroom, it was kind of quotes from authors. And one was from C.S. Lewis that was, I've never had a cup of tea large enough or a book long enough to satisfy me.
Yeah, I love that quote.
And so another thing that she did, our current culture is obsessed with happiness, a side effect of the positive psychology. At one point it was even called happiness psychology. Now it's a happiness industry. Happiness is kind of what's used. It's seen as being the ultimate motivation in people, and as the it drives the whole economy. And it's just assumed that what people really want is happiness. But she kind of transcends that here. by wanting all experiences, not just good experiences. And that's pretty brave. That's a whole different way of being in the world.
Yes. And I think when you're really happy, you're less inclined to really dig deep within yourself. So there's something that's attractive and to stay, and not a depressed state, but something close to that, because there's so much to gain from it. There's so much insight.
And so maybe it's not so much happy or unhappy, although negative feelings, we're kind of wired, negative feelings are actually way more motivating than positive feelings.
Oh yes, when you're comfortable.
Excellent.
Why would you want to try to progress or to try something new if you're in a nice, comfy state?
And so what if we kind of define normal as like easily satisfied, easily content? And then there are people that are not so easily satisfied or happy or content.
And do you think that is getting worse in this culture? Because I was thinking if Sylvia Plath lived now, I wonder if she would feel better or worse, because now we have social media and so much exposure to other people's lives that are glossy and are just look so interesting that sitting at home in your normal life, or it's unsatisfying. We're exposed to a wealth of life without even wanting to be exposed to it.
But it can all be comfortably accessed through a screen or through, and yet I just question if that's satisfying at a very deep level.
I mean, it's not satisfying at all, I would say. That's why people feel like they're not enough, because they see, and they know that it's carefully crafted on social media. But even still, seeing people really like travel Instagrams, I look at those and I'm just like, why can't I go to a different country every week?
Yes. So I was just imagining, what if you're Sylvia Plath's psychiatrist or counselor? And there are two. That one counselor is in effect saying, just be normal. And the other counselor is hearing her. I think if she had felt heard, a lot of her torture and maybe even the end of her life might have been different.
But then maybe we would have gotten a lot more writing from her, but then we might not have at all. All of this writing, like when I mentioned I came across this when I was 20, that's when I read The Bell Jar, that's when I bought her journals, and she helped me so much because I felt so similar to her. And if she had a really good psychiatrist that heard her, maybe we wouldn't have had that. That's the case with a lot of artists, though. They hadn't been mentally ill or unhappy or felt like they were limited.
Checkmate. Yes, and I've been focused on the phrase of feel all the shades, tones, and variations, because it is so different from the typical person trying to only feel happy feelings, never feel bad feelings. And it's not that she didn't want success or doesn't want happiness, but it's almost a transcending of that because it was something that she values more than that. And it's kind of interesting that the Buddhism teaches this concept of non-attachment. Well, one of the things you're non-attached to would be success or happiness or a particular grasping for a certain goal. And so rather than grasping, she just has this hunger for...
And that overtook everything in her life.
And she asked quite an unusual question. All the books I want, all the people I want, all the lives I want, skills I want, and why do I want? I don't know if anybody's ever asked that question before.
Yes. And even though there's a few sentences after that, or two, she doesn't really resolve it. She just keeps continuing listing what she wants.
Yes, but that's a question that the reader can kind of take. It's a very interesting question.
Yes, and it's very hard to answer, though. to come up with anything. Why do I want? I mean, she kind of answers it because she wants all shades, tones, and variations. So yes, she does answer it, but there's something deeper there.
Well, she
I
answers
think.
what she wants, not
Yeah.
why she wants.
Yeah.
Yes. Which an existentialist would kind of answer, we're thrown into this world, so as long as we have a body, we have wants. And so it's coming to terms with this idea of having a body is this endless wanting.
Yeah.
Every day we have to figure out we're going to want food. I mean, there are absolute necessities. Like
Yeah.
the wanting never ends.
And when I've seen why do people continue, it's often to continue the human race, to continue. It's nothing that's very imaginal, like you said, or personal. It's just to continue physically, something outside of yourself.
Exactly. Like our wants are supposed to be, in one sense, like our biological wants are kind of, you're able to satisfy those in this world. But the cultural wants or other wants, for most people, they're supposed to be easily satisfied in this world. But the imaginal wants may be behind, like kind of all of the creativity in the human race of not just being satisfied with a full belly.
But the imagination, that's why we've made any discovery we've made, any progress we've made. If it was all just biological, where would we be?
Well, that's actually like perhaps the difference between humans and animals.
Yeah. We would still live as
Well,
animals.
humans are animals,
yeah.
but I mean...
but we would still live as... I don't even know. We are animals, like you said, but as animals.
Very, very close to our biological needs.
Yeah. But often that desire, people turn to religion or spirituality for that. Sylvia Plath didn't. It was very just... She expressed nothing but her desires and didn't turn to anything but perhaps poetry.
Oh, I was talking about kind of the value of being heard. Another approach would be to have a container for your life or for your imagination. And there was really no container for hers other than her journals and her writing.
So this episode is titled "Tend to Your Imaginary Fig Tree." You might be wondering what fig tree has to do with anything. The quote says nothing about a fig tree. But the quote about her desiring a wealth of experience is from her journals. Not exactly sure what year it was written, but I assume it was written before the next quote, which is about the fig tree. And it's probably more famous than the quote from her journal. It comes from the Bell Jar, published in 1960. And to me, this quote from her journal is a rough draft for the fig tree. And it also suggests that this was a common theme in her life, that it's not something that ever got solved. The Bell Jar was published a month before her death. So I'm going to read a bit from the fig tree. I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion. And beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose.
I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one, they plopped to the ground at my feet.
The horror of that. So after this quote, I was reading an article. I think it's in Bustle. I'll have to go back and look. But a writer pointed out that, or she said, the fig tree quote is completely misunderstood by people because the next sentence was, I don't know what I ate, but I felt immensely better after the first mouthful. It occurred to me that my vision of the fig tree and all the fat figs that withered and fell to earth might well have arisen from the profound void of an empty stomach. So, you said that this makes you angry, and it does me as well. Why does it make you angry?
We started the show with talking about kind of discounting, and this is a type of discounting that's reductionistic. It says it can all be explained by this amazing, the quandary, in a sense, we're all in life, and we'll come back to that, but it gets explained away as, well, she was just hungry, which is kind of like saying, well, if she would just be normal, if she would just be satisfied, and that all of her needs were really just concrete needs.
Yes, and she doesn't mention that although she took a mouthful and that she was satiated for a while, that does not mean she will be satiated forever. She will be hungry again and be back in the same place.
Yes. And so our imaginations get hungry again.
Yes.
They get satisfied and hungry again.
Yeah. And although while you're satisfied, it feels like you found the answer and it feels good for a while, over and over
Yes.
again we return to this feeling.
Yes. But she captures something sitting in the tree, starving to death, not because there aren't figs. So common sense would say just eat a fig, but she's captured this sense of starving because of choosing one meant losing all the rest.
Yeah.
And there's kind of a profound kind of time in life when you realize every decision you make is, as you go down every fork of the road, the possibilities begin to become more and more limited. And so there's this, but if you don't choose anything,
You end up with nothing.
exactly. And so this is the insolvable human dilemma in some sense.
Yes, and I relate to this so much. It's a huge part of my daily life. I accomplish almost nothing that I want to do. There's so many things I have planned and outlined, and I have everything around me I want to work on every day, but I can't do it all at once. And that's what drives me mad, that
Yes.
I can't separate my mind to focus on all these things at one time.
Right? So Camus, with the myth of Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill, is perhaps kind of a male version of futility, and that he dealt with philosophically, and kind of how to overcome the rolling the stone up the hill day after day. This is a variant of every day we have to make choices, and every day our choices limit our options and potential futures. And this strange thing, both getting married, having children, getting a job, in some sense that gives a person a context and kind of gives life and creates like all kinds of opportunities. But because she always looked at both sides of things, she saw there were also limits to lifelong commitments.
Yeah, and I was telling you, I mean, I see some of my friends have children and seem so happy and satisfied, and I think, why is one of my biggest fears becoming a mother? And not specifically becoming a mother before I found the right fig. That is what's terrifying to me. Because, as you were saying, that the only way out for her was death, or being a really bad parent.
And being kind of an unacceptable parent in her mind, or just abandoning the children, or just walking away from, especially the marriage was not an option.
No, and Ted Hughes did and it is far more common for fathers. I don't know, I mean, you're a father, I don't know if you experience that kind of limitation, but a lot of fathers don't have that limitation that mothers have. They can still be free and have a career, have a life, and that's something that women are fighting for now, to have a career and motherhood.
With the similar kind of dilemma of feeling torn between, we're all feeling so torn between all of our commitments now.
Yeah, and struggling to find a balance, but mostly struggling rather than finding.
Yes. So this idea of not being able to move or being paralyzed by choices, in a way she articulated something with this metaphor that had maybe been dormant in a lot of people, or it's an experience people have, but being able to use this metaphor allows them to get their hands on what the difficulty is.
Yeah.
And so it's a great contribution, just this one metaphor.
Yes, it's perhaps her most well-known contribution as well. I've seen it out of context many times. That's why when I saw the article that was discounting it, saying it's always taken out of context, that's taking away from people the importance of it, the comfort of not finding an answer, but finding out that somebody feels the same way you do.
Right? Who knew a metaphor could be a contribution? And yet it can, and it can live inside people. It can really help people come to terms with their life.
Yes.
Not everyone, but like you don't need it if you're not struggling with this dilemma.
Yeah. And would it really be a good metaphor if it resonated with every single person? I mean, I don't think any artwork, any contribution's meant to resonate with everybody.
Right. So when I said we have to talk about this, way back in the 70s, I was in a brain and behavior class, and the only thing I remember from it, it was very interesting, the cerebral cortex that like controls movement, you get coordination by inhibiting all the wrong moves. So that's why you have gross motor movement before fine motor. And you have a background in ballet, and it's like, it's very, very refined in a way. If you think of it in this way, only allowing the right move is inhibiting all the wrong moves.
But some people find a lot of freedom with structure.
Yes. Parallel, later on, as I was hearing about ADD, the interesting thing about it is when you're concentrating, only a small portion of your brain lights up. If you have ADD and most of your brain lights up as you're trying to do something, you're not concentrating. So what the frontal cortex allows you to do, or the executive function is all about, is inhibiting all the things that you don't need to pay attention to. The ability to pay attention is really the ability to focus is really the ability to not be distracted.
So are we saying that she had
So
ADD?
if you're looking at all the figs at once,
your brain's just lit up.
it just lit up, but you can't focus on the one that you want. And so in a way, when we want everything at once and we want all the experiences, it's inhibitory.
Yeah. And in school, ADD, I don't know how long it's been such a big problem or like such a common thing with children. People try to solve it, to give medication, to tell, like, just stop it. But there's something to value in that, isn't there?
It's long been known, kind of people that like kind of, here's creativity again. There's very much an association between not doing things in the typical way and finding a new way to do things, and ADD. Having to improvise, having to, like, not taking the common, well-defined path.
But that's getting something done. I for me, for Sylvia Plath, I mean, she did get a lot done, but that's, the brain's lit up, but you're also freezing. Like, you're not even finding a new path. You're not finding any path. You're just looking at everything.
Because you're trying to walk down all the paths at the same time.
Yeah, it's impossible to choose a path when they all look so attractive. And you walk down one path, it might feel really good, but if you can still see the other path, if you can still imagine it, you're going to run backwards. You're going to run back to the beginning when you haven't even gone halfway.
What was also impossible for her was to let go of any of the wanting. Because the hunger was so great.
Yeah.
To let go of any particular fig. Or as she began to move in her life, rather than fulfillment, it felt more and more perhaps like a prison.
Yes, and there's not many solutions for that, because I used to read a lot of books about creative advice, writing advice, and most of the advice is just do it, just write. Write every single day. And that's great, but it doesn't work for everybody, no matter how much you want to do something. There's not a lot of advice for people that are like Sylvia and that are just frozen by possibility.
Excellent. It's the thing I run into. It's a general truth that may not apply to every individual situation. And the general truths don't apply to individuals.
Yes, that's a common theme that we talk about, that the general doesn't, but the more specific something is, the more universal it is.
Yes. And then there was her journal, and then the work that she meant to be published. Mm-hmm. But you've said, like, the journal's beautiful in its own way.
I connected with the journal more than any of her writing.
And she may not have never seen it as like her production.
Yeah, it was probably never intended to be seen by anybody but herself. Journals are supposed to be the most private thing. That's why, like, diaries for little kids have locks on them. It's for their eyes only.
Yes. And then sometimes in therapy I call it the hanging judge, but it could be the hanging editor or the critic that no matter what you do tells you it's no good, it doesn't matter, it's worthless, you haven't really done anything. And so every day you kind of do something, and then the critic kind of erases it. And it creates this sense of like starving futility.
Yes. And the critic, it does have its place, I think. But when it gets too loud and takes over everything, that's when it becomes a huge problem.
Excellent. That's why I use the hanging judge. Mm-hmm. You're guilty, like it's not a trial, you're guilty before he sees the evidence. Versus a good judge would be a good editor or a good critic, is actually evaluating the quality of the material. But the hanging judge more often lives inside us.
And how do we handle that judge, though? What do we do to that judge? That's something I still haven't been able to figure out. And some people some people work with such confidence in everything they do, or not work with such confidence, but like put out work, constantly work, and then they're able to look back and judge. That is what I think, that's my goal.
It at least gets out. Yes, if the judge shuts it down before it gets out.
Yeah, need a judge that can work and just wait. Wait
Excellent.
A little bit.
So you put him in the closet.
Yeah, because like I said, he does have his place. I see a lot that people desire to just get rid of the judge and this kind of comes back to our talk about like the necessity of not just happiness, but a wide array of emotions. The judge is a part of that.
Sylvia Plath, maybe no one completely identifies with their professional work. And so the critical judge in her was not kind of certainly there for her work, but it was like her very life from as far back as she could remember. There was a part of her psyche that wanted to do away with her. that didn't have her best interest at heart, that was destructive toward her from the very beginning.
And that's why she was treated for mental illness, but it wasn't, maybe she didn't have the right treatment, or it was something greater. There's a much better understanding of it now than there was in the 1950s.
So, battling this, it's amazing she did what she did. Like, again, you can see the achievement, the courage, the, just the, desire, maybe kind of, to fight this, to have as much life as she had, to live as long as she did, and to produce what she did.
Yes, because it's only recently that it's more acceptable to talk about mental illness, to see it as not something inherently wrong with a person's character.
Because there are always people in the tortured place.
Yes.
And they're alone.
Yes. And that's, and this is kind of what Book Sense is. We talked about in the first episode, I said that is how I helped myself when I was a teenager, especially reading books from often people that, Sylvia Plath, when I was a teenager too. Nothing helped me more than this direct message. Stephen King said that writing is like telepathy. And I don't think there's any, not even though work is edited often, I don't know if there's anything other than writing that is so direct from somebody's mind, from somebody's consciousness.
And so maybe it's what we, like a little extra gratitude or respect for authors that have been in tortured places and that are willing to,
Yes.
Go to those places.
Because that requires a lot of bravery. Maybe, and the goal is that you don't have to be brave to share your hurt or whatever you're experiencing, but, the yellow wallpaper in the 19th century, Sylvia Plath in the 1950s, there's a lot of bravery there.
Writing it is one thing, it's experiencing it.
Yeah. And that's the necessity. And looking back, you can almost, say that was her purpose.
So going back to the biological wiring, we're wired for pleasure and happiness. So how do authors end up in these, why would people be willing to go into, negative places?
Yeah, it's often seen as selfish to be so stuck
self-indulgent.
Self-indulgent to be stuck in these places when really, what helps people more? Obviously therapy and help, but sharing.
Excellent. You found the right word. She was seen as self-indulgent. Or this type of poetry or this type of exploration has been labeled as self-indulgent.
Yeah, it's called confessional. It's self-absorbed.
Yes. When it turns out, it could be very generous.
Yeah, and that's something, honestly, I'm just now realizing, because in college, my very first writing classes, everything I wrote was confessional. Also because I just had no experience. I didn't have anything but my own experience, but I stopped writing that type because I felt embarrassed by the reaction.
Yes.
I didn't get a really supportive reaction, and I just let it all out there. I didn't know any better. I didn't hide anything. And I just felt very embarrassed, and I stopped.
Which is why her journals are so good.
Yeah.
Because she didn't hide anything.
No. And unfortunately...
And perhaps she didn't know any better.
Yeah, and Ted Hughes burned her journals too. Not all of them, but he burned several of them. Imagine how much more we could have gotten out of them if he wouldn't have taken them from us. So, share your journals.
Yes. Well, in the first show, I commented several times you said share. That maybe Book Sense, there is this sense of authors are sharing, we're trying to share. What you're sharing is an experience or experience But what if it is like driven by generosity and a desire to help?
Yeah. And it's sharing, it's not forcing it upon
Excellent.
anybody. And that's what's important.
Authors can't force. That's what that's what I love about books.
Yes, unless it's assigned to you in school and
And
you're
it
forced
changes
to
it.
read it. Yeah, and then it's usually not as enjoyable if you're forced to read it. But yes, it's all optional. It's there if you want it. So many great books are not widely read, and that's okay. It's not for everybody.
In one of our episodes, we use a quote by Marshall McLuhan that goes, "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew." This is how we see Book Sense. Gale and I are crew, so are you. We hope for your contributions, perspectives, and conversations to build Book Sense and make it better and better. Until next time,